And joining us now on the debate in Washington, D.C., Jacob Kierkegaard, Research Fellow at the Peterson Institute of International Economics. In Kingston, Ontario, Louis Gagnon, Professor of Finance at Queen's University. And here in studio, Don Breen, Professor of Finance and Economics at the University of Toronto, and Doug Saunders, European Bureau Chief at the Globe and Mail, who was most recently here talking about his book, A Rival City. Good to see you two here in the studio, and to our friends in Points Beyond, thank you for joining us as well. Jacob, let me go to you first, because I guess in some respects we're going to do a bit of a primer here for those who have not followed this as carefully as you have. Ireland, it lost a degree of its, I guess you want to call it economic sovereignty this past week. Tell everybody what happened.
Well, I mean, Ireland is kind of a tragic case, really, which is a country which did pretty much everything by the book. But what it failed to do was it failed to control its banking systems, and which is ultimately what has brought down the government, is essentially a reckless, in my opinion, guarantee issued by the Irish government to fully cover all the private debt in its banking system. And ultimately what they had to acknowledge, which is what they did a couple of weeks ago, was that the source of the problem in the Irish banking system was too big for little Ireland itself to deal with.
So let's understand this, Don. How did private bank debt become a public taxpayer problem?
Well, the accumulation of bank debt in Ireland in the reckless fashion that Jacob described becomes a liability that the banks themselves cannot handle. The government then steps in and says, well, these banks are a crucial part of our economic infrastructure. We can't allow them to fail, to collapse. We have to contain the damage. And so therefore, government moves in and recapitalizes the banks.
We've got a little pie chart here just to show what you just talked about now. Michael Smith, if we can bring this up. We call this the size of the problem. Here are the country's banks most exposed to Ireland. And let's start in the top left-hand corner and just sort of go around clockwise. Look at the UK, very exposed, and Germany, also highly exposed to the Irish situation. Then the United States, a little less, Belgium, a little less, the French, the Japanese, and the Spaniards, and then others as well. Add it all up, it's $731 billion of exposure. That's a serious problem. Louis Gagnon, how, in heaven's name, do you begin to pay that back?
Well, it's going to take an awful lot of time, and obviously a small economy of the size of Ireland, which is about $225 billion in GDP, doesn't generate enough to pay all this debt in one fell swoop. So there was no choice but to get a massive cash infusion from the European Union and the IMF to restore confidence in the system and put everybody at ease that there's enough support for the banking system in Ireland for Ireland to continue working and operating independently, with all its sovereignty, and also to prevent the rest of the European system from falling apart.
Doug, you're the one guy here who's not a PhD in economics, so I'm going to ask you a different kind of question, which is, the Irish sense of themselves a decade previous was pretty impressive, right? This was a country that was firing on all cylinders, and now, what has this done to Ireland's sense of itself?
It has wounded it, but it's also done some damage to its sense of its place in Europe. Ireland, more than almost any other country, used the mechanics of the eurozone, of membership in the 16-nation bloc that uses the euro in its currency, to develop itself, to create a boom. Now, in the minds of Irish leaders and many business people, this was happening out of shrewd economic planning, through a government that was open to trade and investment and so on. But it was also largely happening because Germany was a major exporter within the same currency bloc. Ireland was a major importer of many things and so on. And the currency imbalances between, what would have been currency imbalances, the payments imbalances between these places caused a lot of debt to flow into Ireland from Germany, as you see there, from Britain, from France, from the wealthier countries of Europe, and to pool up and create a bubble. And all at once, of course, they're realizing that it's not a single currency bloc where everyone's working together. Suddenly the Germans and the British and the French are pursuing a policy where they are trying to get their money back from Ireland as quickly as possible. I mean, the feeling in Ireland is that this is not a bailout to help Ireland or to help the Irish. It's a bailout to get the money back out of Ireland to the banks of Germany and so on. And there's a lot of anger about that.
Okay, let me follow up on that with Jacob, and I'm going to, I'm getting older, I can tell, because the Financial Times now isn't, that small type is impossible to read. But, okay, Jacob, I'm going to quote Martin Wolf to you. Martin Wolf's got a piece in here today saying, bank debt simply cannot be public debt. If bank debt is to be such debt, bankers should be viewed as civil servants and banks as government departments. Surely, creditors must take the hit instead. What do you think of Martin's view that this can't be something that the Irish taxpayer has to be 100% on the hook for?
No, I largely agree with Martin Wolf on that. I mean, given the sheer scale of this, the hole in the Irish banks, this is going to saddle future generations of Irish with what is potentially ultimately unsustainable levels of debt. And don't forget, I mean, I agree that previously we just heard that, a lot of this exposure is being, to British and German and other, non-Irish banks. But actually, I think that the politically most explosive aspect of this is actually the fact that the Irish themselves are contributing 17.5 billion euros to this bailout, out of which about 10 billion is going to come from the National Pension Reserve Fund of Ireland. So essentially you have a situation where the sitting Irish government is basically raiding the national pension system in order to pay off senior creditors in its banking system. And I'm not sure that is a calculus that's going to hold past the coming Irish election.
Well, following up on the Wolf piece, Don, do you think the private interests in this case should have to take a bigger haircut on this than it looks like they're currently taking?
Well, it's always difficult to argue with Martin Wolf, but I think that in what he's addressing are the ways to deal with the immediate problem. I think some of the more serious challenges are the problems in say the intermediate term. You must remember that the European Union is not a confederation like Canada. It's not the United States of Europe, and this has implications for how it can get out of financial difficulties. There is an article of the treaty, Article 125, which actually prevents nations from transferring wealth from one to another, and except in conditions of hurricanes or earthquakes. So there's a meteorological language in the financial situation we're now in, but you can't say that some of these problems, as we saw with Greece and Portugal and now with Ireland, that to some extent are self-made. You can't really suggest that these are natural disasters, that the European Union is going to come in and allow bilateral buyouts. That is just against the spirit of the European Union.
But Louis, let me try one more thing on this issue of who should have to take the bigger haircut here, the private interests involved, the creditors, or the taxpayer of Ireland. Play it through for us. I know this is not an option that anybody's considering, but play it through for us. What if the government of Ireland simply said, we're going to let these banks fail?
Well, this would be a tragedy, because without banks, you don't have a credit system, and without a credit system, you don't have an economy. Banks are absolutely essential ingredients to make an economy go. So we are, if you will, at the mercy of the banking system, which makes us so vulnerable to it that, of course, we have instituted rules, regulations, especially we've put regulators in place to make sure that those banks which fulfill a social service of such importance actually carry out their duties without getting ahead of themselves. The big problem in Ireland is that since 2001, there was a phenomenal boom in real estate fueled by extremely low interest rates and massive amounts of money coming from Europe that were lent to the Irish to fuel this property boom. And there was no regulator in Ireland who was actually overseeing the banks and looking at whether or not the banks were indeed lending to good businesses or simply relaxing all their lending standards and abandoning the ship to greed. So
let me follow up with Doug on that. Louis says that if you allowed the banks to fail, they made mistakes, they made bad investments, they made bad loans, let them fail. He says that would be a tragedy. Do you agree?
What is being described, I mean, look, if you're strictly going to allow them to fail or allow a government to fail, then you are pushing over a domino that is going to set the people, it's going to cause whoever is owed money by that bank to fail, and the potential cascade of crisis. But there is something being discussed that Angela Merkel, the German chancellor, has brought up, which is the idea of making those who own the banks, those who own the debt in the banks, the bonds, responsible for their failure as something that's built into the bonds from the beginning. To change the way that this works, so that it's no longer the governments of Europe that are on the hook for failed banks, but it's the people who own the debt in the banks. Now that's going to obviously affect the ability of banks to raise credit in the future, but it may be the way that things go, because I don't think politically or financially they can stand much more of this.
And Jacob, one more question on the Irish banking situation. I thought the European Union did these so-called stress tests on banks all over the place, and you know, theoretically, at one point, I guess these Irish banks passed the test. Well, look where they are now. Does this mean that all of the stress tests across the banking system of the European Union must now be considered suspect?
Well, certainly this isn't good for the credibility of the overall credibility of these tests, but it has to be kept in mind that these tests were carried out under the broad framework of the sort of common European guidelines, but it was actually the Irish National Bank and national authorities that carried out the stress tests themselves. So the immediate spillover from those Irish national tests to other European countries is not that great. I mean, I, for instance, think it doesn't necessarily impair, if you like, the stress tests that were carried out in Spain, for instance.
Okay, that's good to know. Let's go now to Don Breen and talk about Portugal. It looks as though the next country that may spin out of control is Portugal. What's their problem?
Portugal is a problem of growth, or the lack of it. A few minutes ago, we discussed the case of Ireland and everything coming together in Ireland as a result of good economic decisions a number of years back when they entered the euro. Portugal didn't do that. Portugal didn't make the kinds of investments in people and infrastructure that would be the foundation of their economic growth. I think that Ireland will grow out of its problem, but I don't think that there's much prospect for economic growth in Portugal because they don't have a good policy framework to encourage the economic growth that they ought to be able to develop.
Louis, how significant would you put the Portuguese problem compared to, you know, Ireland, Greece, the others we've seen most recently?
I'm with Don on this. Basically, Portugal does not have the growth prospects to pull itself out of this mess. Fundamentally, thanks to a 12.5% corporate tax rate, which is the lowest in the European Union, Ireland has been able to engineer a phenomenal economic boom that brought in companies like Hewlett-Packard, all the big companies, Microsoft, Intel, everybody, which now accounts for 70% of its exports. And it's an English-speaking population with, extremely well-trained. Nobody else has tried this trick, certainly not Portugal. So therefore, Portugal is in a much more vulnerable position than Ireland. And indeed, I believe that in due course, it'll take an awful lot of time. Ireland will be able to pull itself out of this mess. But clearly, growth prospects are so low now in Portugal that it's clear it's very difficult to see any hope.
And Doug, play that through for us. If the growth levels are so poor and the economic prospects seem so lousy, play the next 5 years out for us. What does that mean for Portugal?
Well, Portugal's a small economy. So like Greece, yes, they could afford to bail it out if they had to. The Portuguese wouldn't like it. The German voter and taxpayer certainly wouldn't like it, but it's within the possibilities. The problem with that is that, not in 5 years, in a couple months, that could create a cascade of distrust among investors, among bondholders, that could spread to Spain. Now, Spain is a much bigger problem.
Hold off on Spain. We're going to get to Spain.
I know,
Okay.
but I mean, Portugal and Greece, they're troubled economies. They're not strong states, and so on. Ireland was its own special thing because it was a banking and property failure, really removed from the state until they bailed out the banks. So the problem with Portugal is that once things spread to Portugal, that could mean larger and more ominous things.
Okay, Jacob, let's talk about Belgium. Some people are saying it looks vulnerable now too. How so?
Well, I mean, first of all, the principle, there's two things in Belgium. One is that it has a large debt stock of about 90 to 95% of debt to GDP. And then, of course, this is a country that doesn't have a functioning government right now. It has a caretaker government, basically because the two regions, the Flemish and the French-speaking, cannot agree among each other. And there is a genuine fear among some that the country is simply going to break up. And then the question is, well, what's going to happen with all the outstanding debt?
You got an answer for that?
Well, I mean, my answer is that I don't ultimately believe that Belgium is going to break up. I think you're going to move to a different sort of loose federation with extensive autonomy for the two main regions, as well as Brussels, the capital. So I mean, I basically do not buy the argument that Belgium is insolvent, because it's also a country that actually does have quite an impressive record in reining in government deficits. It brought down its debt from 140% in the early 1990s to today about 90%. So it's got a fair amount of credibility on this front, I'd say.
Don, you remember that movie, If It's Tuesday, It Must Be Belgium?
There you go.
Well, today is Wednesday, so now it must be time for Greece. So let's do Greece. How similar, I mean, we've obviously seen the pictures on the news about the rioting and the demonstrating that's going on in Greece. How similar are the Greek and the Irish, for example, situations?
Oh, those are very different situations. Greece's problem is a problem of sovereign debt, and
Which means what?
It means that the government owes money to banks around the world, and in Greece's case, particularly to Germany and France. And Greece is a classic example of fiscal mismanagement. They were involved in spending programs that the country just simply could not sustain. And also, evidence is coming out, I mean, it's all published by the IMF, that Greece actually entered the eurozone under, we might call them false pretenses. They really misrepresented their fiscal position, their debt position, and their deficits in the years that followed their entry into the euro. There's a serious problem of fiscal mismanagement in Greece. Now, in Ireland, on the other hand, Ireland's case is something like a mini version of what happened in the United States. They had a very large housing bubble. All of the housing financing was held by banks. When the housing stock fell, the banks were in serious trouble. So Greece and Ireland are very different. So therefore, also the solutions to their problems are somewhat
Will be somewhat different. Okay, Louis, let me follow up with you then. If you were telling us a few moments ago that you basically were betting on Ireland eventually to get out of the mess that it's in right now, how similarly do you want to bet on Greece's future?
Oh, I wouldn't put too much money on Greece because Greece's situation is very, very precarious, as Don was saying. Basically, the Greek economy is paralyzed. There's no foreign direct investment. There's very little growth. It's impossible to start a business in Greece. People retire in their late 50s. They have incredible entitlements. They don't declare their income, and they misreport their debt, and the government doesn't keep track of its expenditures. So it's an incredible basket case, and growth prospects are not there. So how will the Greeks ever be able to pull themselves out of this situation? Not with any economic engine that will help. So I don't see an end to this one. This is an extremely difficult one. So I wouldn't bet any money on Greece, but I would be willing to bet money on Ireland. But Ireland will take an awful lot of time to work its problems out.
Okay, Doug, let's move into sort of the next segment of our discussion here, which we're calling fear of contagion. We've talked about the so-called peripheral countries of Europe right now. How much concern is there that this financial contagion could actually spread to Europe's most significant economies?
Oh, absolutely huge. I mean, it's absolutely terrifying everyone in Europe right at the moment. Particularly in Germany, which is enjoying a huge economic boom at the moment, right? I mean, record low unemployment. Not since reunification 20 years ago have they seen such good economic figures. Meanwhile, there's this sense that they're having to spend all their money bailing out the countries that are dependent on them, essentially, around the perimeter. And if it spread to Ireland, and Ireland's bailout didn't work, at which at the moment it looks like it didn't, in that the bond prices have not fallen to the levels that they should have if a bailout were successful. The borrowing costs for Portugal are shooting up, and even for, as we've seen, Belgium, and even for Italy, and even for France somewhat, are now shooting up above the German level, which means that the people who lend money to countries do not believe the Irish and Greek bailouts have completely worked, and believe that there are ominous things in the future. And when the bond investors believe that, it tends to happen because they drive up the borrowing costs so high, suddenly Portugal can't borrow the money week to week to keep its operations going. It needs bailout. If that spreads to Spain, which is the fourth largest economy in Europe, suddenly you're getting into a size of economy that couldn't be bailed out so easily.
Doug is anxious for us to go to Spain, Don, so we're going to go to Spain now. Let me read this by Paul Krugman in the New York Times. Michael, if you would, this graphic. The best thing about the Irish right now is that there are so few of them. By itself, Ireland can't do all that much damage to Europe's prospects. But then there's Spain. What's striking about Spain, from an American perspective, is how much its economic story resembles our own. Like America, Spain experienced a huge property bubble, accompanied by a huge rise in private sector debt. Like America, Spain fell into recession when that bubble burst and has experienced a surge in unemployment. And like America, Spain has seen its budget deficit balloon thanks to plunging revenues and recession-related costs. But, unlike America, Spain is on the edge of a debt crisis. The U.S. government is having no trouble financing its deficit, with interest rates on long-term federal debt under 3%. Spain, by contrast, has seen its borrowing costs shoot up in recent weeks, reflecting growing fears of a possible future default. Why is Spain in so much trouble? In a word, it's the euro. Tell people what he means by that.
The euro, 16 nations with a common currency. If all nations have a common currency, there are no exchange rates between and among them. There's no flexibility. There's no flexibility in policies that might otherwise involve an exchange rate. We in Canada know that our exports, our trade position changes as our exchange rate changes. But within Europe, there is an absolute fixity of exchange rates between and among any of the nations there. So what we're seeing, when we said that there's no growth prospects in Portugal and the growth prospects in Spain are very, very dim, what would happen if you did not have the euro, and this is exactly what Paul Krugman is referring to, you would see a currency, the Portuguese currency, formerly the drachma, or the Spanish currency, formerly the peso, would decline, and that would give a boost to their export sector, would lower the value of their wages in terms of other currencies, and would start growth going again.
Can't do that now.
You can't do that with a fixed exchange rate. We are now dealing with the kinds of fixed exchange rate problems that led to crisis after crisis in the late 60s and the early 70s, for example.
So, Jacob, what was the thinking by the Spaniards, for example, or the Portuguese, thinking that, yeah, let's get in on the euro, and yes, we'll give up these levers of economic sovereignty, but there are other advantages, such as what?
Well, I mean, initially what they benefited from was very, very low real interest rates. Ultimately, of course, that sort of bit itself in the tail because it led to this enormous and unsustainable housing boom. But that was, I believe, one of the biggest potential benefits that these countries saw. Then it was also basically viewed as it was an anchor of stability, precisely because they felt that they did not have to go through the kinds of roller coaster rides with massive depreciations in the escudos and the pesetas as they had experienced earlier in the 1990s. So there was that aspect as well, and then ultimately also it was sold as a sort of symbol of European integration, as a tool to which to achieve economic convergence and rapid economic growth towards the eurozone average.
Okay, let me go to Louis with this one then. I want you to compare and contrast two countries, the United Kingdom on one hand, Italy on the other. They both have reasonably large economies. They both have significant budget deficits. One uses the euro, Italy, the other one doesn't, the UK. Is there a lesson to be drawn here, Louis?
Well, yes, there is a lesson to be drawn. It's extremely difficult to bring many countries together in a formidable, ambitious project such as the euro, the European Union, to run the economy and to have a unified monetary policy, but no unified fiscal policy. It's a bit like playing basketball with one hand tied behind your back. It's extremely difficult. Now, the British have kept their currency and they've kept their fiscal policy, and they have two levers to play with, whereas the Italians are at the mercy of the economic growth of say, Germany. And they have no way to readjust or rebalance their economy through exchange rate or monetary policies, which basically work in tandem. So it's extremely difficult when you give up this flexibility, unless all the parties sitting around the table have exactly the same value system, same economic growth prospects, and same, of course, interests. They're all lined up. It's very, very difficult. There will be people who will suffer, and there will be people who will be in good shape. Just think of Greece. When they came into this euro, a bottle of water would cost them, say, something like 50 cents. Immediately upon joining the euro, that same bottle of water cost them $1.70. So there was a convergence in costs, but never a convergence in salaries. And they had no mechanism to rebalance the whole system.
Doug, follow up.
Italy is a good example because Italians all remember how it used to work before the euro, which is that every few years, Italy would get into an economic crisis. It would respond by essentially running the printing presses, adding a couple zeros to the lira, so the 100 lira note became a 10,000 lira note, and then a million lira note, and so on. And it would get out of it that way by devaluing. Eventually, the exports would come back because its currency was so cheap, and so on. It's not a nice way to live. It's not a great way to do things. It was that sort of cycle of currency crises that also pushed people to join the eurozone.
There's no point in saving that money, is there?
Yeah, but this is the problem, though, is that we've replaced a system where we have to have these terrible currency devaluations and so on with a system where instead it's the same currency. So what happens is debt pools up to an unsustainable level. And I don't think that can be helped terribly. I think you can talk about rules and discipline and so on, but as long as debt is issued by each separate country. So I think that one of the questions for these guys is can we work through a system where the 16 nations have one set of bonds issued in the center? The Germans would hate it, but it might be the only solution.
Don Breen, you want to tackle that?
I was going to say, when that further to Doug's comments, a lesson that we are going to take from this, it'll be a lesson over the longer term, is that you cannot build the framework for a common currency by reliance on fiscal indicators, such as debt to GDP or deficit to GDP. All of not all, but several of the European nations simply did not report their numbers accurately when they entered the euro, and they continued to misrepresent them after. And there is absolutely no mechanism within Europe to contain the fiscal behavior of the member nations. And that then is a recipe for beggaring thy neighbor in that sense, or for being irresponsible.
Jacob, can I get you to speak to Doug Saunders' point more directly? You want to put it again, Doug? You want to put about the bondholders? You want to put that one more directly?
Yeah, is there a realization that this crisis is going to recur? Well, even if they can somehow get out of the current one and at enormous expense and bail it out, we're just going to be in a situation again where debt crises, there are going to be these imbalances between the importing and exporting nations of the eurozone. Is the only solution to have a system where there's a common fiscal system and debt is issued by the European Central Bank on behalf of all the other countries?
Go ahead, Jacob.
Yeah, I mean, I think that a couple of points on that. One is that if you actually look at the way the European Financial Stability Facility, the 440 billion entity that actually today just went and issued its first bonds, that actually is essentially the functional equivalent of a euro bond or a sort of a common European bond, because it is ultimately guaranteed by all the member states. And similarly, if you look at the new actions, or most recent actions by the European Central Bank, you know, when they go out and they purchase assets in the secondary market, you know, which are clearly sort of monetary policies measures that have fiscal policy implications. Well, given that the European Central Bank's balance sheet is also shared on a pan-European basis among the members of the Eurozone, this is, in my opinion, also a sort of stealthy step towards far more fiscal integration in the Eurozone. So in my opinion, we are taking baby steps in this direction.
Baby steps. Let me try this from the Washington Post. Robert Samuelson wrote about this just a couple of days ago in the Post. What you need to know about Ireland's economic crisis is that it's not about Ireland. It's about Europe. For decades, Europe has pursued two great political projects. One is the democratic welfare state, designed to improve economic justice through various social safety nets. The other is European unity, symbolized by the creation in 1999 of a single currency, the euro, now used by 16 countries. The fact that both contributed to Ireland's troubles suggests that Europe could be on the brink of a broader crisis. Cherished values and ideals are under assault. The euro, intended to nurture unity, has bred discord as countries assign blame and argue over sharing costs. The social contract is being rewritten, with government benefits and protections being cut. The proposed rescue of Ireland, as with Greece before, resembles a gamble that Europe can arrest growing doubts and win the patience of bondholders and voters. Whether the gamble will succeed is unclear, as are the potentially chaotic consequences if it doesn't. Louis, I wonder if we could start by having you tell us how seriously or how significant are the efforts by member countries in the eurozone right now to get out of the euro?
Well, I don't think that anybody wants to. Anybody within the eurozone wants to give up the project. Certainly not the weakest. Certainly not the weakest members who might seem to be in a position to gain something out
so
of.
despite all of these, despite
but
the loss of economic sovereignty that we've talked about today, nobody's saying we want out.
No, I'm not seeing that really clearly. What we're hearing though is the Germans really clamoring and complaining about all these profligate countries that are not doing anything about their fiscal situation and who are not playing the game according to the rules.
Doug, you want to follow up on this?
I mean, just to note the paradox of this is that we actually have countries trying to join the eurozone now. The three Baltic states are well on their way to trying to get in. Iceland would like to join, which would be the first non-EU member to be in the eurozone, and the Scandinavian countries are seriously considering it because their little currencies took a real beating during the worst of the downturn.
Okay, explain this to me, Don, because they've already, we're hearing complaints that, and Louis has said it before, you know, if you don't have the economic levers to, you know, lower your own currency, for example, you're playing basketball with one hand behind your back. As far as I know, nobody in the NBA wants to play basketball with one hand behind their back. So why do these other countries want in?
Oh, first of all, remember that the establishment of the eurozone was an economic exercise in political unification. Not full unification, but it really had a strong political agenda, especially between France and Germany. And as you read, I think quoting from Robert Samuelson's piece, there are a lot of non-economic aspects of the European Union that are worth defending and for which the euro then is something of a token. But the other nations want to join the European Union because the euro area for in view of the opportunity for greater stability, for greater trade relations, and I can see them clamoring to enter. But the euro is really now in a period of great stress, and I think they will come through it. There are, even though you don't have exchange rate adjustments to correct growth and differences, there are other mechanisms by which factors move across Europe. You must remember that when the European Union was established as an economic entity, they lowered barriers, reduced barriers to labor mobility and capital mobility. So that's the kind of adjustment process you get if you don't have exchange rate flexibility.
Well, okay, let me follow up with Jacob on that then. If you don't have this independent ability to play with your currency, what other options do they have?
Well, I mean, they only really have, in my opinion, the option of doing, you know, a real internal or domestic adjustment, which is essentially to put in place structural reform measures that's going to increase productivity, or outright, as we've seen in Spain, in Portugal, in Greece, and to a lesser extent in Italy, as well actually as Ireland, cut public and private wages to basically restore their competitiveness. So this is really the only sort of policy lever they have left. But if I could just add one more thing, the idea about that life inside the eurozone is going to get a lot tougher for these countries. That's certainly true, but you know, we got to think about what would it actually entail if these countries were to leave the eurozone? How would they actually reestablish their own physical currencies, and what would that mean for their economies? And I will just say that would mean, in any shape or form you look at it, an absolute domestic economic disaster, followed by complete regional isolation in political and economic terms. So I can't see any democratically elected government who would ever want to leave the eurozone.
Louis, do you agree with that?
No, I agree with Jacob, actually. I mean, the eurozone is a phenomenal economic space. Everybody wants to join in who is nearby, because you've got this huge market. You have trading potential. You have phenomenal opportunities. In fact, this whole crisis is the result of too many fake opportunities being pursued. I mean, there was overheating. But at the end of the day, for a period of time, people were working. They were having jobs. There was construction all around. There was growth everywhere. Ireland was a Celtic tiger. No, it's but a pussycat now. But you know, this was enormous, and so clearly there's a great potential, and people always look on the bright side when they think of an economic space at this time.
Doug Saunders.
The risk, actually, of someone dropping out is that the Germans will drop out.
So it's not the little countries, it's the biggest one.
It's the guy at the center, the sine qua non of the eurozone. If their government, their voters grow tired of bailing people out, feel they're spending a third of their tax money, say, on bailouts, which is conceivable. And you're starting to hear this sotto voce. You're starting to hear people in some German circles say maybe we should bring back the Deutsche Mark. We would be a stronger exporter. We're now the world's second largest exporter. Our strength is being hindered by the fact that we have these people relying on us. If they drop out, that will end it.
Go ahead, Jacob. I see you trying to get in.
Well, I think first of all, we have to be clear that if the Germany were to drop out of the euro, the first thing that would happen would be that the new Deutschmark would shoot through the roof. So in fact, if Germany were to leave the eurozone, you know, their export economy would be, you know, seriously under threat. And also, we have to keep in mind that for Germany to undo the eurozone would essentially mean the dissolution of the EU as we know it, because it would undermine the European internal market, among other things. So essentially, what you would be talking about is this, the German government undoing everything that Germany has stood for in terms of European integration since the end of World War II. So that's the politics of it. The economics of it is that the German banking system has easily over €1 trillion in exposures to the peripheral countries. And you know, if they were to reintroduce their own currencies, all of this debt would face, you know, basically impairment. So if Germany were to leave the eurozone, they would essentially cause the complete collapse of their own banking system. So in neither political or economic terms do I believe that any credible scenario can be created in which it is in Germany's own national interest to undo the euro.
Jacob, you get the last word today. That's Jacob Kierkegaard from the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington. Louis Gagnon, merci beaucoup encore une fois, monsieur. On the line from Queen's University, Doug Saunders, The Globe and Mail, A Rival City, his latest book. Don Breen, Professor of Finance, University of Toronto. Thanks so much, guys, for a great discussion. Appreciate it.